She thought it was the wind. But when Eleanor opened the cabin door that stormy night, what lay crumpled in the snow made her heart seize. Not a stray dog. Not a coyote. It was something wild and wounded. Something that wasn't supposed to trust humans. Yet in that frozen moment, their eyes locked, and nothing would ever be the same. This wasn't just a rescue. It was the beginning of a bond that would defy nature, defy fear, and bring two broken souls back to life. What would you do if a wild animal begged for your help? Stay tuned. The cry in the cold. The storm came in fast that night, swallowing the Minnesota wilderness in a white, howling blur. Wind battered the wooden siding of Eleanor Barnes' cabin, and trees groaned under the weight of accumulating snow. Inside, Ellie stood barefoot on the rug, a cup of herbal tea forgotten in her hand. It was supposed to be a quiet evening, like every other since she'd left the world behind. But then she heard it, faint, like something stuck between a cry and a cough. A sound not quite human, not quite animal. She moved to the door, pressing her ear to the thick timber. The cry came again, closer, raw, desperate. Grabbing the old wool blanket from the chair, she cracked open the door against the screaming wind, and froze. A creature slumped just a few feet from her porch steps, half buried in snow. It was a bobcat, but not the kind from television shows or documentaries. This one was real, so real it made her breath hitch. Its coat, usually tawny and thick, was streaked with blood and frost. Its ear tufts were dusted with ice, and one hind leg bent at a strange angle. The animal blinked slowly, eyes heavy with exhaustion but still glowing gold in the storm light. A North American bobcat, tail nearly a stub, young, maybe 2 years old at most. It shouldn't have been anywhere near her cabin. It shouldn't have come to her. Instinct kicked in. Years of trauma nursing surged to the surface. Ellie didn't think, she moved. She stepped out into the cold, her bare feet vanishing into inches of powder, and bent slowly to the ground. "I'm not going to hurt you," she whispered. The bobcat didn't growl, didn't lunge. It watched her like it understood, like it was asking. She dropped the blanket slowly over the animal's trembling form, then gently scooped it into her arms. The weight surprised her. It was lighter than it looked, bones sharp beneath the fur. As she carried the creature inside, Ellie realized her hands were shaking. From cold, or from fear, she wasn't sure. Inside, she laid it down on an old quilt near the hearth. The fire popped once, casting dancing shadows. The cat didn't move, but its eyes stayed on her. She whispered again, softly, without thinking. "You came to the right place." And somehow, in that moment, she knew it was true. The snow howled against the windows, but the silence inside was electric. A wild thing had crossed her doorstep, and she had let it in. Despite the storm outside, something warmer than the fire began to stir inside that room, an ancient instinct, a quiet agreement between two broken creatures. What came next would test everything Ellie thought she knew about healing, trust, and herself. A nurse's instinct. The warmth from the fire slowly crept across the wooden floor, stretching its fingers toward the lifeless shape curled under the blanket. Ellie knelt beside the bobcat, careful not to make any sudden moves. Her cabin, built for solitude, suddenly felt crowded, not with noise or chaos, but with the gravity of this moment. It had been years since she'd felt the weight of responsibility for a living being. Yet here it was, staring at her with gold-flecked eyes dulled by pain. She ran her hands along the animal's side, her touch clinical but gentle. The left hind leg was clearly broken, swollen and twisted, a clean break, likely from a fall or a trap. There were shallow cuts along the flank, the fur crusted with dried blood and dirt. Its breathing was shallow but even. No signs of shock yet, but that could change fast. Ellie glanced toward her kitchen, where a battered red medical kit rested on top of the fridge. She hesitated, then stood and retrieved it, every step practiced, automatic. Years ago, she had been a trauma nurse in St. Paul. ER rooms, sterile corridors, fluorescent lights. Her entire life had been wound care, CPR, emergency stabilizations. She left all that behind after the night she lost Daniel. And now, a bobcat lay in her cabin, trusting her with its life. "I guess we're both a little broken," she whispered, kneeling again beside the cat. "Let's see what we can do about that." She worked quietly, gently cleaning the wounds with warm saline and gauze. The bobcat hissed once but didn't strike. Its tail, barely more than a nub, twitched once, then lay still. She couldn't splint the leg properly without sedation, and she didn't have tranquilizers. But she could stabilize it temporarily with fabric and a makeshift brace from an old hiking pole. It wasn't ideal, but it would hold. As she worked, Ellie spoke softly, not out of habit, but instinct. "You're lucky," she murmured. "A few more hours in that snow, and you'd have been a frozen statue. Just another story people tell around a campfire." She placed a shallow bowl of water and a dish with shredded cooked chicken nearby. The bobcat didn't move, but its nose twitched, picking up the scent. Ellie sat back on her heels, brushing her red hair away from her damp forehead. Her heart was still hammering. "What are you doing, Barnes?" she whispered aloud, staring at the wild animal that now shared her cabin. But in the silence that followed, as the fire cracked and the wind howled outside, a strange calm settled over her. The fear had faded. In its place was a steady, purposeful energy she hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just about saving a wounded animal. This was about something she couldn't name yet, something ancient and sacred. And it had just begun. By the time the sun rose over the tree line, the storm had buried the world in silence. But inside the cabin, Ellie and the bobcat had crossed a threshold, one of trust, of survival, and perhaps of healing. The days ahead would test them both. But neither of them would face it alone. The eyes that watched. The blizzard faded into morning like a ghost retreating with the night. Outside, the world was buried under 2 feet of fresh snow, blanketing the trees, the hills, and the path back to town. Ellie stood at the window, sipping lukewarm coffee, her eyes not on the white horizon, but on the shadow near the hearth. The bobcat hadn't moved much during the night, but it hadn't slipped away either. That was a start. She'd placed a towel and a few soft fleece shirts near the fire for warmth, forming a makeshift bed. The cat had curled into it, chin resting on its paws, those golden eyes never leaving her. They were watchful, but no longer terrified, as if waiting to see what she would do next. Ellie took a deep breath and knelt down beside the creature again. She kept her movements slow, deliberate. The stitches on its leg held, and the swelling had gone down slightly. She replaced the warm compress, whispering idle things as she worked, about the snow, about the quiet, about her plans for the day. Not that she had any. "I should probably give you a name," she said softly, brushing her fingers just short of the cat's ear. "Not Shadow, and not Ash. You're more vivid than that." The bobcat twitched but didn't growl. "Sable," she said aloud, as if the word had chosen itself. "Strong, silent, surviving." The name settled into the room like smoke curling into corners. Sable. Over the next 2 days, a fragile rhythm began to form between them. Ellie kept her distance during feedings, setting down bowls of cooked meat, then stepping back. At first, the bobcat waited until she left the room before inching forward. But on the 3rd day, Sable limped to the bowl with Ellie still nearby, her wild eyes locked on the woman even as she ate. Ellie didn't move. She barely breathed. That one moment felt louder than words. But trust, even when born in desperation, wasn't a straight line. On the fifth morning, Ellie reached to touch the fur around Sable's shoulder, trying to apply antibiotic cream to an older wound, and the bobcat snapped. Not hard, not with violence, but with a warning snarl that rattled deep in its chest. Ellie backed away immediately, palms up. Okay. Too soon. Got it. Later, she sat near the fire, rubbing her temples. I used to think trust was something you earned once and kept forever. Now I think it's something you borrow, a little at a time. That evening, as snow began to fall again, Ellie read aloud from an old dog-eared novel, her voice soft and even. Sable watched her from across the room. When the fire cracked too loud, the bobcat flinched, but didn't move. When Ellie coughed, Sable's ears perked. It was strange, this quiet companionship. They were two creatures not meant to share space, not meant to share silence. And yet, here they were, in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of winter, in the middle of something neither of them could quite name. And every day Sable stayed, every day she didn't run, Ellie's own walls began to soften, walls she hadn't realized were still standing. But not everyone believed wild belonged beside human. Out beyond the tree line, suspicion stirred. And soon, Ellie would learn that trust wasn't just hard-earned, it was also easily threatened. Not everyone approves. It didn't take long for word to get out. Ellie hadn't planned to tell anyone. She hadn't gone into town. She hadn't posted anything. But news traveled fast in small places, even when the roads were covered in snow and the phone lines sagged with frost. The first sign came one morning, 4 days after the storm broke, when the sound of crunching snow and spinning tires echoed up her long driveway. Ellie stepped outside, her breath clouding in the air, just in time to see Travis Huxley's pickup grind to a halt near the edge of her porch. Travis was a man built like the North Woods, hard, silent, and slow to thaw. In his late 50s, broad-shouldered and grey-bearded, he had lived on his property down the hill for more than 2 decades. A hunter by trade and nature, Travis valued order, discipline, and the unspoken rules of the wild. And he didn't like surprises, especially not the kind with claws and fangs. "You got something in there you shouldn't," he said, nodding toward the house. Ellie raised an eyebrow. "Morning to you too, Travis." He stepped out of the truck, boots sinking deep into the snow. "You think we're all stupid?" Karen from the gas station said she saw bobcat tracks leading right up to your front steps. Big ones. Fresh. Ellie didn't answer immediately. She looked at the trees behind him, calm and white under the morning light. Then she turned back. "She was injured," she said simply. "I didn't plan on it. But I couldn't leave her to freeze to death." Travis crossed his arms. "You brought a wild predator into your house. That's not just reckless, it's dangerous. She's not hurting anyone. She's healing. She's still a bobcat," he said, voice tight. "Doesn't matter if she purrs like a kitten. That thing's a killer by instinct. You're not running some wildlife rehab up here." "No," Ellie said quietly. "I'm not. But she needed help, and I had the ability to give it." There was a long pause, the air between them sharp as glass. Travis spat into the snow and shook his head. "You've been up here too long, Ellie. You're forgetting how nature works. Animals stay outside. People stay inside. That's the order." He turned back to his truck, muttering, "You keep feeding her, she'll forget she's wild. Then she'll forget how to be afraid of humans." And that's when people, or pets, get hurt. The door slammed, and the engine roared to life. As his taillights disappeared through the trees, Ellie stood motionless, fists clenched in her coat pockets. That night she sat beside the fire, staring at Sable as the bobcat slept near the hearth. Her leg was improving. The limp wasn't as sharp. Her eyes, once dulled by pain, now tracked Ellie with cautious curiosity instead of fear. "You didn't ask for this either," Ellie whispered. "But I'm not sorry I opened the door." The next week brought more signs of unease. A note left on her porch and signed read, "If that cat hurts someone, blood's on your hands." One morning, her mailbox lay twisted in the snow, splintered by something heavy. But Sable stayed. Even as the world outside grew colder, not just with snow, but with suspicion, Ellie held her ground. She didn't answer the calls from town. She didn't argue back. Instead, she focused on healing. Both hers and Sable's. But Sable had come with secrets. And one morning, just after dawn, she would reveal the most important one of all, leading Ellie into the deep woods, toward something crying softly beneath the frost. What Ellie found there would shatter every assumption, and make her decision even harder. The hidden ones. It started with a change in behavior. Sable had been healing steadily, her limp less severe, her appetite stronger. She had begun to move with more confidence, even venturing a few cautious steps into the cabin's hallway. But Ellie noticed something else too. Every morning, around the same hour, Sable would rise and pace restlessly near the front door. Her ears alert, her eyes fixed on the line of trees beyond the windowpane. At first, Ellie thought it was instinct. Maybe the call of the wild was stirring. But then came the morning Sable did more than just pace. She pressed her nose to the seam of the door and let out a sound Ellie hadn't heard before. Not a growl, not a hiss. A soft, almost mournful chuff. A kind of yearning. Ellie stood silently, her coffee growing cold in her hand. Something about that sound threaded through her chest like a needle. She crossed the room, pulled on her coat, and opened the door. Sable didn't bolt. She looked back once, then stepped forward into the snow. Ellie hesitated. Logic screamed at her. The bobcat could run, vanish, undo every quiet step they had taken. But instead of fleeing, Sable limped down the porch stairs, stopped, and waited. Ellie grabbed her boots, shoved them on without socks, and followed. The wind was biting. The forest around them shimmered with frost. Sable moved carefully through the undergrowth, occasionally glancing back to be sure Ellie was still behind her. The path wound through birch and pine, over a shallow frozen creek, and into a hollow where snow lay deep and untouched. And then Sable stopped. She crouched low, letting out a barely audible mewl. That's when Ellie heard it. A faint sound, buried under branches and snow, soft, rhythmic whimpering. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. She stepped carefully toward the thicket where Sable now stood guard. Brushing away pine needles and ice, she uncovered a small depression in the earth, insulated with moss and fur. Inside were two tiny bobcat kittens, no older than a few weeks. Their eyes were barely open, and their bodies shivered from the cold. "Oh my God!" Ellie murmured. The pieces fell into place in an instant. Sable hadn't just been wandering aimlessly in the storm. She had been searching for help, not for herself, but for them. Her leg must have broken while hunting or defending the den, and instead of curling up to die, she had dragged herself to the only light left in the blizzard. Ellie's. She reached into her coat pocket, gently wrapping the kittens in a wool scarf. They weighed barely anything. Their tiny paws pawed weakly at her fingers, their bodies warm but fragile. As she cradled them, Sable moved beside her and gave a low, steady purr, a vibration not of contentment but of recognition. Approval. "You brought me to them," Ellie whispered. "You trusted me with this." The walk back to the cabin was slower. Ellie held the kittens inside her jacket, their warmth pressed against her chest. Sable limped close, ears twitching with every forest sound. By the time they returned, the morning sun had begun to rise through the trees, casting a golden haze over the snow-covered clearing. Inside the cabin, Ellie prepared a nest beside the fire with towels and old blankets. She laid the kittens down gently, and Sable immediately curled around them, her body wrapping like a shield. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was family. Ellie sat cross-legged a few feet away, stunned by the quiet weight of what had just happened. A wild creature had led her to its young, had trusted her not just with its life, but with the lives of its children. In the silence that followed, tears welled in Ellie's eyes. Not from fear, not from overwhelm, but from the realization that something ancient and wordless had passed between them in that forest. Something that couldn't be explained, only felt. But not all storms come from weather, and not all threats announce themselves with howls. As the kittens thrived and the bond deepened, a far more violent danger would soon ignite in the quiet woods, one that would test Sable's strength, Ellie's will, and the fragile peace they'd built together. Flames in the silence. The days that followed were quiet, but not peaceful. Ellie barely left the cabin. Her world had shrunk to a circle of warmth around the fireplace, where Sable now curled protectively around her kittens. The little ones were growing stronger, their eyes open now, their mewls louder and more insistent. Ellie watched them with a mix of awe and trepidation, knowing full well how fragile this sanctuary was. Outside, the snow had frozen into icy slabs. The silence of the forest had changed, less stillness, more waiting. She noticed shadows in the woods. Once, a flash of movement behind the tree line. Another time, boot prints in the snow that didn't belong to her. And then, a bullet casing left on the porch. She didn't need a note to know who had left it. Travis. She kept her rifle loaded and near the door, though she hated the thought of using it. Still, she knew the rules out here. Nature wasn't the only thing that could turn savage. That night, the air was colder than usual. Ellie double-checked the fire in the main hearth, then moved to the side cabin, a storage shed connected to the main house by a narrow breezeway. It was where she kept spare firewood, propane tanks, tools, anything too bulky for the living space. She smelled the smoke before she saw the flames. The side wall of the storage cabin was ablaze, orange light licking up toward the eaves like a serpent's tongue. Ellie's heart slammed against her ribs. No, no, no! She dashed back inside, yanking a fire extinguisher from the pantry. As she burst into the cold again, she heard a faint noise, footsteps crunching away into the woods. But she didn't have time to chase ghosts. The flames were spreading fast. She aimed the extinguisher low and swept across the base of the fire. The smoke burned her lungs, the heat blistered her face. Sparks leapt toward the breezeway, threatening to reach the main cabin. Inside, Sable was pacing, agitated, eyes glowing like embers. The kittens yowled. Ellie coughed violently, eyes stinging. She emptied the extinguisher, buying just enough time to stomp out the flames with snow-drenched towels. By the time she returned to the living room, her clothes were soaked and scorched. She dropped to her knees, gasping. Sable limped toward her, pressed her head against Ellie's shoulder, and let out a deep, low rumble, not a warning but a grounding sound. The kind you make when you recognize someone barely holding on. Ellie buried her face in Sable's fur and whispered, "They want us gone." But in that moment, as the embers died outside, Ellie realized something vital. They had already come too far to turn back. But the fire had been a warning, and it wouldn't be the last. Because the next time danger came, it wouldn't knock. It would strike. And Sable would have to make an unthinkable choice to protect the woman who had once opened a door to a stranger in the snow. When the wild protects. The next night the fire was out, but the tension burned hotter than ever. Ellie barely slept. She had moved the kitten's nest deeper into the cabin, away from windows, and kept her rifle by the hearth. The scent of smoke still clung to her clothes and hair, a haunting reminder of how close they had come to losing everything. Sable didn't sleep either. She paced between the rooms like a sentinel, her injured leg dragging but her posture fierce. Something had changed in her, some ancient instinct awakened fully now. Not just a wounded creature surviving, but a mother defending. At 2:14 a.m., the cabin exploded with sound. Glass shattered. A rock crashed through the front window, followed by the unmistakable hiss of a lit flare rolling across the wooden floor. Ellie jolted awake. The kittens shrieked. Sable launched from the corner with a feral snarl. The flare's light bathed the walls in red. Smoke began to fill the room. Ellie grabbed a wool blanket and threw it over the flare, snuffing the flame. Her hands burned from the heat, but she barely felt it. And then a shadow moved outside. A figure. Gun raised. Ellie dove for the rifle, heart pounding. She aimed toward the open window, but froze when the figure stepped forward. It was Travis. And he wasn't alone. Two men stood behind him, rifles slung, faces hard. "Give it up, Ellie," Travis shouted. "That animal doesn't belong here. You've lost your mind, keeping predators in your living room. You want to wait until it kills you in your sleep." Ellie didn't reply. Sable stood between her and the window, body low, ears flat, every muscle coiled. "She saved me," Ellie finally said. "She saved those kittens. And she's not the threat here." "You're wrong about that," Travis growled. He raised the rifle. And that's when Sable moved. Not toward the window, but toward Ellie. Just as a shot rang out, Sable slammed her full weight into Ellie's side, knocking her to the floor. The bullet tore through the air, embedding in the wood behind them. Ellie hit the ground hard, ears ringing. Sable lay sprawled across her chest, trembling. Outside, the men shouted, but the gunshot had awakened the forest. A chorus of barks rose from somewhere deeper in the woods. Wild dogs, maybe wolves, and the men began to retreat, panic breaking their nerve. "You'll regret this," Travis bellowed, fading into the trees. Silence returned. Ellie's breath came in gasps. Her hands clutched Sable's fur. Blood soaked through her sleeve. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." The bobcat lifted her head. Their eyes met, and in them Ellie saw no fear, only a fierce, wild love. Sable had chosen, and she had saved her. Again. But dawn was coming, and so were answers. What happened next would change how the world saw Ellie, and how she saw herself. Because some bonds, even those born in silence and snow, are meant to endure forever. The price of loyalty. The sun rose over the horizon like a whisper, casting soft gold across the snow-blanketed clearing. Smoke still curled lazily from the blackened wall of the side cabin. Inside the main room, Ellie sat cross-legged beside the fireplace, one hand wrapped gently around a bloodied towel, the other resting on Sable's steady flank. The bullet had grazed her, not a deep wound, but enough to leave a red streak across her ribs. It could have been fatal if not for Sable. The bobcat hadn't moved from her side in hours. Ellie's own body ached, bruised from the fall and the panic, but her mind stayed locked on one truth. Sable had risked everything for her, for someone she should have feared. Later that morning, Ellie made a call. Not to the sheriff. He wouldn't help. She called the nearest wildlife rescue center in Duluth. She explained everything: the rescue, the leg injury, the kittens, the attack. There was silence on the other end. Then a single question. "Is she still with you?" Ellie looked over at the sleeping bobcat curled around her kittens. "Yes," she whispered. "She never left." Within 2 days, a licensed wildlife biologist named Rachel Bennett arrived by snowmobile. She moved with the quiet efficiency of someone used to wild things and careful hands. She examined Sable, the kittens, the burns on the porch, the shattered window. "I've seen a lot," Rachel said, her voice low. "But this is something different." Ellie didn't argue. There were no words that could explain the bond that had formed in this small cabin between two beings who had every reason not to trust. Rachel nodded toward Sable. "She's almost healed. But if she's to survive and raise those kittens, she needs space. Real space. Somewhere protected." Ellie swallowed hard. The thought of letting go tightened something deep in her chest. But then Sable looked up. Their eyes met. And Ellie knew. This wasn't goodbye. It was just the next part of the journey. Rachel made arrangements with a sanctuary on the edge of the boundary waters. Hundreds of acres of protected forest, streams, and dens. A place where the bobcat and her young could live safely, away from guns and fire. Sable left the cabin in a padded carrier, but not before one final moment. As Rachel secured the latch, Sable pressed her forehead gently against Ellie's hand through the mesh. No sound, no growl, just contact. And then she was gone, vanishing into the white woods with her young. Ellie stood on the porch long after the snowmobile disappeared, the wind cold against her face. She didn't cry. She just stood quietly, feeling, for the first time in years, that she had done something that mattered, something that healed more than just wounds. But some doors, once opened, never truly close. And as spring returned to the northern woods, Ellie would discover that wild things, once loved, always find their way back, no matter how far they roam. Where the wild things return. Spring arrived slowly in the north. The last snows melted into glistening pools, and the trees began to bud with cautious green. The birds returned first, then the scent of pine carried on the warming wind. Ellie's cabin, still scarred from the fire, had begun to feel like a home again. She patched the broken window, rebuilt the side wall with donated lumber from a few kind-hearted neighbors. Not everyone had turned away after the fire. Some had even offered to help. But the silence left behind by Sable and her kittens was something Ellie couldn't repair. She missed the sounds, the low purrs, the soft padding of wild paws on old wood, the golden eyes that seemed to see right through her. Still, she didn't regret letting them go. Some things aren't meant to be kept. They're meant to be protected and released. One morning in late May, Ellie drove out to the sanctuary, a half-day's trip through gravel roads and winding forest. Rachel met her at the gate, waving her through with a smile. "She's adapted faster than we expected," Rachel said. "Strong, smart, and the kittens, growing like weeds." Ellie didn't speak. Her hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. Rachel led her through the reserve on foot, deep into the woods. No cages here, just natural fencing and observation trails. A wide valley lay open beyond the trees, dense with brush and crisscrossed with animal tracks. Then, from the ridge, Ellie saw her. Sable. Larger now. Her coat thick and clean, her stride powerful. The limp had faded to almost nothing. She stood on a boulder beside a sunlit clearing, her two young cubs tumbling in the grass below. They chased each other with wild abandon, pouncing and wrestling, innocent and fearless. Ellie didn't call out. She just stood. And after a long moment, Sable turned her head. Their eyes locked across the distance. Recognition passed between them, not flashy, not loud. Just a shared stillness. A memory. A bond. Sable blinked slowly, then lowered her head in a motion almost like a bow before leaping down to her cubs. Ellie watched until they vanished into the brush. She didn't follow. She didn't need to. Somewhere between the snow and the fire, between the fear and the trust, they had become more than rescuer and rescued. They had become family. And family, even the wild kind, never truly leaves. That night, back in her cabin, Ellie lit a fire, not out of fear, but comfort. She made tea, then stepped out onto the porch, listening to the breeze through the pines. She smiled, because now, when she heard a cry in the woods, she didn't feel alone. She felt connected. Sometimes, the greatest acts of healing begin not with a plan, but with a choice to open the door. This story reminds us that compassion doesn't always look like comfort. It often shows up cold, broken, and unexpected, like a wild creature in the snow. But when we choose to see past fear and offer safety, even for a moment, it can create a connection that lasts a lifetime. Whether human or animal, every being wants the same thing: a place to feel safe, and someone who sees their worth. At Paw Prints Stories, we believe in the everyday miracles that happen when hearts, both wild and human, choose trust over fear. If this story stirred something in you, ask yourself, what would you do if compassion came knocking? Would you open the door? We invite you to become part of our journey. Follow Paw Prints Stories for more tales of resilience, loyalty, and the bonds that change us. And here's your challenge. This week, do something kind, without expecting anything in return. Not for attention, not for praise, just because something or someone needs it. You never know how far a single act of kindness will go.